I hope you had a great weekend, and you know, if you like snow, I hope you got it, and if you don't like snow, well, then I hope you didn't. Okay, yeah, so that's kind of what we're going with. Quickly, guys, first of all, good morning. Stand by. Still working with this crap here, and it's just it's really kind of getting old. I am feeling better. For those of you, thank you very much for the notes. I appreciate it. So yeah, getting better, but still just not quite right. But I think we've known that for quite a while. Anyway, guys, what we're going to do, we're going to wrap up here on the chart section. We're going to press into airport operations. But a couple of things. Number one, after Friday, I hope you guys believe me when I said that it was important to understand this book and to understand what is where. It's kind of the old adage about being an attorney. It's not necessarily what you know, but it's what you can look up. Well, it's kind of the same thing here, is that one of the things that you're responsible for as a pilot is when you're flying from one place to another is being aware of all information having to do with your flight. Well, you know, parts of that have to do with airports, airport configurations, runways, frequencies, things like this. And that's where you get this information in advance, you know, during your planning phase, so that you can make good decisions. And that's what this is about. It's about helping you make good decisions. So you found the definitions part in here, because the reason that that's important is because so many of the definitions and abbreviations are actually used to make this guide half the size that it normally would be if you actually spelled out all the words. And that's one of the reasons that they abbreviated, is to make these a little bit smaller. And yeah, you're looking at this and you're thinking, okay, smaller, well, you know, that's part of it. So that's kind of one of the things that you know, you have to be aware of. And in addition to that, you also have to know about the information for each airport, and using the legend at the beginning of this book to understand where all of that stuff comes from. So that's the big part of it. Oh, excuse me. That one kind of snuck up on me. Forgive me. So there's that. Second thing, having to do with these maps. Now, my hope is that you have spent some time individually familiarizing yourself with these maps, their legends, etc. Now, the one thing that we haven't gone over here is the terminal area charts. So I'm going to ask you independently to go over these terminal area charts, and you can look everything up. You can understand what you're looking at here. In essence, on one side, you're looking at Class Bravo airspace, because that's where these charts are, because they give you kind of a different scale, not kind of, but they do give you a different scale of the information that you're looking at. And so, you know, instead of this being, 20 nautical miles, this may be only 10 nautical miles, meaning that you get a great deal more detail here in these, in kind of congested areas. So they're useful when you start thinking about Class Bravo airspace, Class Charlie airspace, also with your travels. So make sure that you're familiar with this as well. There's not a lot of different things between the sectional map and the terminal area chart, but you need to be aware of those also. Okay. So now then, without further ado, we're going to press into airports and airport operations. Oh, by the way, your next quiz is going to be over chapters 12 and 13. 12 and 13 is going to be your next quiz, so just letting you know. Remember, in chapter 12, all of those maps, all of those things at the end of chapter 12 that I told you that you were responsible for, all of those text windows that you have inside each one of those little figures and legends that you see here on the end of chapter 12, you're going to be responsible for those. And guys, it's just, you've just got to go over it. You just have to read it. there you go. Okay, into airport operations, because at some point the assumption is that you're going to take off from somewhere and you're going to land at somewhere, and hopefully those somewheres are going to be airports. So there we go. Pardon me whilst I sip. Ah, yes. So again, as we looked at in the sectional maps, we know that there are towered airports and non-towered airports. There are different colors on the maps. And yeah, I don't know, there we go. Okay. And so you have to understand what those things are for, understanding the different types of airspace, because you have things like Aspen, which is class Delta airspace certain times, class Echo airspace at other times, because it says so right there in the chart supplement guide, doesn't it? So we look at these here because now we're starting to look at the airports themselves, taxis and runway markings. When we look at this here, you can see that you have different things kind of going on with regard to taxiways as well as runways. One of the things has to do with the fact that on taxiways, you're going to have yellow lines on the sides of the taxiways, and then the lighting that you're going to find on the edges of taxiways that you'll notice at night are going to be blue. So that's one of the things that you're going to see with regard to taxi signs. All of these markings, all of these things that you see here, you're going to get tested on this because you've got to know what this is that you're looking at with regard to airport operations and driving an airplane around on the ground when you're out there. This look familiar? If you guys look right there in front of the FMX, that's called our hold short line. That hold short line requires an airplane to stop every time that they're on the solid side of that line. So when you're on the taxiway heading to an active runway, you stop here and you get permission to cross. So it's the same way that we have in the classroom. That's why those lines are there. You have to have permission to get in the FMX. You got to have permission to go around the big bald man's desk. So that's why the hold short lines are there in the floor. When you're coming off the runway and you're coming onto a taxiway, you come off the runway and you go past this, the hold short line, and stop again on the solid side of the hold short line. So the two solid lines, you stop every single time. And the only time that you wouldn't is that if ATC gave you clearance to cross. And one of the things that I always do is that if it's not real busy communications wise, I will always just double check before I cross that and just check with ground control to make sure that I am cleared to cross that line before I cross a runway. So if they give you permission to cross the runway, you can cross the runway. But I always like to check if it's not real busy on the ground channel. And here we also have signs. So one of the things that you'll see here is that you'll see here the signs for the runways. So what you're looking at is that a red sign with white numbers indicates that in front of you, you're going to see runways 9, which is going to be on the left, and runway 27, which is going to be on the right. So if you taxi down to the right and then you turned back to your left, you're going to be taking off on runway 27. If you taxi down to your left and then you get onto the runway here, you're going to be taking off on runway 9. The hold short lines here, that's what those means. No entry signs, pretty self-explanatory. Then here in figures 13.5, you'll notice here that you have a displaced threshold. So here you see what is traditionally like the beginning of the runway here where you see the numbers. But now you see this thing over here with arrows on it. Well, the reason that they'll do a displaced threshold on the runway is that let's say that there's an obstacle and they want to keep your glide path well above whatever this obstacle may be. So what they'll do is that they may add an area here of a displacement that will allow you to land here, making sure that you clear whatever obstruction or obstacle that there may be in your path on the way here. And the other thing that you can do here is that you can think of this here as the non-landing portion of the runway. So they don't want you to land here, but can you actually use this to taxi and perhaps take off from this? Yes, you can. So just like in Aspen on runway 33, if you look at your chart supplement guide and you look at the airport diagram, you will see a displaced threshold on runway 33. And I want you guys to take a look at that on your own. And you can see what we're talking about there with the displaced threshold. So it gives you, in essence, almost another 1,000 feet for you to work with, for you guys to take off on runway 33, but you can't land on that portion. So, and then coming back the other way on 1.5 is that you can also use that extra 1,000 feet as an overrun if you need it. Chances are you won't, because you're kind of going uphill there anyway, but you can if you need it. And so that's one of the things that airports will do to kind of keep the operational safety in check, but also to give you extra room to use as you need it. And so this is a displaced threshold. Here, again on figure 13.5, you'll see these chevrons. A chevron is kind of like a little arrow looking thing, but they're full across here, so they're like V-shaped things. These are yellow. And what this is just, there are no operations here on the chevrons. So nobody uses these chevrons except for kind of a blast pad area or a safety overrun also coming the other direction. The runways here with the big X's on them talk about the fact that they're closed. Okay, 13.7. This is one of the things that you're going to see on runways, most runways that have ILS approaches to them. A lot of the big commercial airlines, when they're using these, will use these markings here for kind of the fast movers, sort of the big boys. But we also use these here as little guys when we're flying with instruments. So when we look here, we can see that we have the threshold marker. A lot of times people will call these the piano keys. Then you'll see the runway. This is 20 left. So 20 left implies that there are parallel runways here, because if you have one that's marked 20 left, the assumption will be is that you have a 20 right. And you could also have a 20 center. So there could be as many as 3 runways here, all parallel. So you have left, center, right, perhaps. And so here's the numbers, and these numbers appear in the first 500 feet of this runway. Then at 1,000 feet, this is where they call this the aim point marker, or what we refer to as the 1,000-foot markers. And the reason that we call these the 1,000-foot markers is because they're 1,000 feet away from the threshold markings, the end of the threshold markings of the runway. Cleverly enough, that's why we call them the 1,000-foot markers. I know. This is going to be your aim point when you are on an instrument approach. All of your guidance will bring you down to a glide path that terminates here at these 1,000-foot markers. One of the things that happens, and this happens on a transition standpoint, is that, for instance, when you're looking here at the threshold, a lot of times on VFR stuff, you're looking right here at the numbers, and they'll have you use that, your instructors will, they'll have you use that as kind of your visual approach, and you're looking at those numbers when you come in to land. sometimes it's kind of hard when you're practicing and you go from VFR to your instrument stuff to actually now take your focus here to the 1,000-foot markers as opposed to the numbers, because you start looking at the numbers and you're coming in here to land on the numbers. Well, your VASI and your PAPI will tell you that you're low, and that's because of the fact that you're coming in here at a more shallow glide point than you would have if you would have hit right here with these 1,000-foot markers. So that's just kind of letting you know what's going on. And then you can also see here that you also have these other smaller markers here every 500 feet. So you've got this one at 1,000 feet, 1,500 feet, 3,000 feet. And remember, based on your reading, is that you do need to land within the first third of the runway. Okay, so there we go. Airport lighting. You can look at this here, and one of the reasons that we have different colors of lightings is so that it can aid pilots in knowing exactly where they are. If you notice that you're taxiing between lights that are blue, you'll notice that you're on a taxiway. If you're taxiing between a bunch of lights on the sides of you that are white, well, you're on the runway. So that's kind of part of it there. And you can look at that there. Pilot controlled lighting. How do we use pilot controlled lighting? We use that so that at non-towered airports or airports where the towers close at a particular time, you can actually dial up on your it can either be like the Unicom frequency or the Common Traffic Advisory frequency. It'll tell you in your chart supplement guide what frequency it is. And what you do is that when you're self-announcing, and that's what you do when you're not at a towered airport, you'll key or press the switch. It's called a push-to-talk switch, PTT, and that'll be on your yoke in most cases, yoke or the stick of your flight controls, because they want it right here. And in most cases, when you're flying the airplane, everything is set up to fly with your left hand and then run all of your other controls with your right. So everything is going to be right here on the left side of the yoke or on the stick here, and to use everything with your left hand when it comes to your push-to-talk switch. So what you will do is you will key the mic, and keying the mic means you press the button. And when you're on the right frequency, the Common Traffic Advisory frequency, if you press the button 7 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, what that will do is that'll put the runway lights on the highest highest illumination factor. So they'll be the brightest when you do that, hit it 7 times. 5 times goes to a medium setting. 3 times goes to a low setting. And the way that you want to use that is this. When you're further away from the airport, you want to turn those lights on bright, because you want to make sure that you know where they are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And that'll turn them on bright. Once you get then, and you're in the pattern now, you're flying your downwind leg and you turn on base, I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I put the lights down on a medium setting. Then when you turn final, you get everything looking good, everything is all lined up, 1, 2, 3. And that puts them down on the lowest intensity setting. Why do you do that? Well, if you think back on the chapters that we had before, and we talk about the visual illusions having to do with flight and about what those bright lights can mean, when the lights are on bright, it gives you the illusion that you're lower than you actually are. And so what happens is you think you're down here, but you're actually up here, and you have a tendency to flare too high, and that can lead to kind of a rough landing. So you can go back and look at that as to see why we do that on these pilot controlled lightings, and we can adjust the intensity settings of these lights. When we look here again, you can see here what's going on. The taxiway lights, as I mentioned before, you'll see these. These are going to be blue. Center line of some taxiway lights, they can be green. One of the interesting things, and this has to do with one of the XED courses that we went on a couple years ago to Ohio, is that we actually got to go out onto the airport runway at dark in these vans that we had. And what was happening is that the Ohio State University was testing the in-ground lighting system that they had. And what they were doing is that they were, when you're talking on the radio on ground control frequency, they can give you what they call progressive taxi instructions. They'll kind of call your turns and help you, you know, which is when they have time and you're in an unfamiliar airport, it's helpful. But what they're doing is they're they're experimenting with these in-ground LED light panels. And what they do is that it'll show this green light, and the pilot will follow this green light off the runway, off the taxiway, and they'll follow this green light around to get to where they're going. So they basically use the lights as kind of a follow the bouncing ball kind of a thing, and it kind of gives them the visual progressive taxi instructions versus just the audible taxi instructions. So it was really kind of cool to get to see that. And at some airports, they do something similar to that. So, you know, look for that coming up at an airport near you. We can see here at the threshold, we have the green lights on the approach end. At the departure end over here, you've got the red lights, side white lights there. Runway lighting, you can take a look at this. Hurl, Merle, and Lurl, you can also look those up in your chart supplement guides now that you know how to use those. Reel and rail, you'll also remember that from your chart supplement guides. Your touchdown zone lighting, remember that we want to be here in that first 3,000 feet here in the landing touchdown zone area. Runway center lighting here. One of the things is that when you land at a big airport, for instance, I think of Albuquerque and runway 8 and 26, and it's a big long runway. It's over 13,000 feet long, so it's pretty sizable. And as you're coming in and you're landing there, your center lines, they're all the in-ground lights. Well, they have this little dome on top of them. And you know how we always talk about center line discipline, you know, with your nose wheel on everything? In some cases, that nose wheel can sit there and it'll just absolutely just vibrate the living tar out of you in your airport. In those cases, you do want to be offset slightly so that you don't just keep slapping those light covers on the runway, because that's just that's kind of a rough ride. Approach lighting systems, ALS. This is kind of what we've talked about here before. The visual approach slope indicators. These give you here the two lights, normally on the left side of the runway. In some cases, they could be on both sides of the runway. And you can see that not just on the illustration, but also in your chart supplement guide. It will also tell you where those are. So you have the 2-bar VASI. That's kind of the most common that you'll see at most of the runways until you're actually at some of the bigger runways. For instance, Aspen is a little different. More about that in a second. So when you're looking at this and you're looking at a 2-bar VASI, what you're after here is you're after red over white. Now, here's the way to think about this. White over white, fly all night. That means that you're too high. So when you have two white lights there on a 2-bar VASI, you're too high. When you're on glide slope, you're going to get red over white. You're all right. Red over white, you're all right. Then the red over red, it's a little bit more morose, but the saying that goes along with this is red over red, you might be dead. That means you're low, people, okay? So red over red is not a lighting condition that you want to find yourself in coming into Aspen, because the one thing you do not want to be coming into Aspen is low, okay? It's better to be high than it is to be low. And when I say high, not that, goodness, but slightly high on your glide slope is a more favorable condition than to be low in mountainous terrain. So I think we can all understand that. So that's how you remember that. White over white, fly all night. Red over white, you're all right. Red over red, you might be dead. And you can look and see how these are. One thing too here, if you'll notice on figure 13.10, is that you have angles here that you kind of need to be within in order for these lights to work for you. So in this case, you have to be within 4 nautical miles of the approach end here of this runway, of the threshold, and you have to be within 10 degrees either side of that center line in order for you to receive useful information from the VASI, because that's kind of how they have these things angled. In some cases, what they'll do is that they'll use the 3-bar VASI in some instances, and the reason that they use the 3-bar VASI is because when you have bigger airplanes and you're coming in, your airplane is going to be perhaps on the glide slope, but you're sitting a lot higher off the runway because you're in a much bigger airplane. So the 3-bar VASI, what you want is that if you're in a smaller airplane, and you notice that on your chart supplement guide, it says that the airport that you're landing at has a 3-bar VASI. You're going to know that it's got 3 bars, and what you're looking for are the bottom 2. You're looking for the bottom 2 lights. Red over white, you're all right. You don't worry about the top one, okay? You're looking at the 2 bottom ones. Now then, here on this we have the PAPI. So with the PAPI, this is what you see in Aspen when you're approaching on runway 15 in Aspen. You have 4 lights to the left of the runway. And those 4 lights, you can see there that you have, they of course change color. And what you're looking at there at the top is that you're looking, when you see 3 red and 1 white, you can kind of think, okay, well, if 1 red and 1 white is okay, I'm looking here and this might tell me that I'm just a little bit low. Okay, so I'm a little below the glide slope here with 3 red and 1 white. 2 red, 2 white, I'm all right. If I've got 3 white, I'm a little high. Now, if you think about this and you see 4 red, you know you're way low, and that's not good. Also, 4 white, you're really high. So, on glide slope, 2 white, 2 red. Just slightly below glide slope, you've got 3 red, 1 white. And then slightly above the glide slope, 3 white and 1 red. Okay, you have a pulsating P-VASI here, which is a pulsating VASI. If you have a pulsing white light, you're above the glide slope. Steady white, you're on the glide slope, and in some cases it'll go red and white on the other system. If it's a flashing red, you're below the glide slope. Now, there's one other thing that happens here with these glide slopes, and it also kind of happens with some of the ground-based radio navigation that you have for your glide slope when you're landing an airplane. If you come at this runway from above the actual path portion of this slope, and by the way, normally these are going to be set out on about a 3 degree. 3 degree is going to be the most common glide slope. This is by far, this is almost a 45 degree glide slope, so it's doesn't really look like that. In fact, let me go ahead and do this real quick here, because really the way that it works is that the glide slope itself here at the 1,000-foot markers is going to look more like this. In fact, that may also be a little bit high, but that's really what it looks like. It's not as pronounced as it shows in that guide there. But when you approach that glide slope from above, you may get a false visual signal from certain approach lighting systems. And just as you would with getting a ghost signal, if you try to approach your glide slope from above on an instrument landing system, and we'll talk more about that later. So you definitely want to keep your altitudes correct and approach that from below. This is the tricolor VASI that shows this, and one of the things that can happen is that if you're above that glide slope there, how it's supposed to be at amber, well, in some cases there can be a thing where it shows green, and that's not good. So you've got to make sure that you're kind of coming below it. Also on these, there's a T-VASI system. And with this, when you have, they're all white lights. If they're all horizontal, you're good. If you have the bars extending here above the horizontal lines, that's telling you that you're above your glide slope. But if you have this here where you have the actual lights below the horizontal, that's telling you that you're below your glide slope. So you think of these lights here as your airplane. If you're below the horizontal, you're low. If you're above the horizontal, you're high. Airport beacons. We have all seen airports with flashing beacons, and you can look at this and you can see what these are. And the ones that we see here for civil airports, you have the alternating green and white flashing lights. You'll have green, white, green, white. Those are military. And you'll also see for places where helicopters land, green, white, and green, yellow, and white. And then at water ports, you'll have white and yellow. The other thing is that if you have the weather that deteriorates below your basic VFR weather minimums, these lights will come on at night, during the daytime. I'm sorry, they'll come on during the daytime. Okay? Remember, controlled, uncontrolled airports here. Basic communications procedures for uncontrolled airports. This is something that you're going to be responsible for, so you guys take a look at this. Understand what your procedures are for your outbound, inbound, and also for the practice instrument approaches that you do at these airports. These airports actually, you know, they know that practicing approaches is something that people do all the time, and it's not just good for the pilots, but it's also good for the controllers as well, as to kind of practice with people to you know, practice their skills as well as our skills. So, you know, we all work together on that. But these are going to be the basics here with the recommended communications procedure, and that's right out of the AIM. Lost communications. Transponder. Transponder is that thing, that's that box inside your airplane that sends a signal to air traffic control. When you're on a flight plan, you'll have a discrete code, and that discrete code may be 4136. And 4136 identifies you and where you are, so that when you're on the screen for the approach people, they can scroll their mouse over there, click 4136, and they can tell that that's you. We know who you are. But we also have those in the event of emergencies that we have. So you can also, on your transponder, squawk. That's what we call that. We call it a squawk code, because it's basically this electronic thing, squawking to the air traffic controller to say who you are, where you are. And 7600, that tells them that you've lost your communications. 7500 tells them that you have been hijacked. 7700 is an emergency situation that you have. 1200 is VFR. The one transponder code that you never want to enter is 7777. And one of these days, I really want to talk to somebody at the FAA and see if this is still true or not. But that was the military intercept code. And so 7777 is what they would use when they would fly these drones around for target practice, and they would have a transponder that would squawk 7777, and that's how the pilots would identify them to shoot them down. So 4 sevens is not something that you want to rotate through on your transponder codes. On RG1000s, you have push buttons that push, that you can actually enter the numbers digitally. Back in the day, the transponders used to have these the codes for the 4 numbers, and each one would have its own round dial that you could turn to, and they would always tell you, never rotate those numbers through where you wind up with 7s across the line there, and so you would always want to kind of jockey how you did that if you had 7s in there. So just saying. Also here, light signals. that you have here. These are good. We used to practice these in Albuquerque. The tower kind of liked us doing this as well. You're going to need to know what the standard light signals are, both in the air and on the ground. Each indication of some form of lighting could mean something different depending on whether you are on the ground or in the air. So make sure you understand 13.17. Traffic pattern wind indicators, here's windsock, the wind T, the tetrahedron. We have gone through this. Also notice here that we have the wind barbs that we have here on our wind direction. Collision avoidance. In VFR conditions, see and avoid. That is really what it's all about. We are all responsible to avoid other traffic. Runway incursions. This has been a big deal for the FAA because there really should not be a reason why airplanes run into each other on the ground, but it happens. So we have to always be vigilant anytime that we're actually moving an airplane around with anything there. Standard traffic pattern, we've talked about this before. This is what it looks like here at 13.9. So right now, what this is looking at is that if you can see here, the big mouth on the windsock is over here, and that means that the wind is coming from here. So if we're looking here at this is 9, this is 27. Over here is west, this is north, this is south, this is east. So if you're taking off on runway 9, 09 or 0, what direction are you flying? East. That is correct. So in this case, the wind is out of the east. You're taking off into the wind and you're making left turns. Left turns is standard traffic. Turning to the left is standard when you're in the traffic pattern. However, when you're on an instrument hold, the standard turns in a holding pattern are to the right. Makes perfect sense, doesn't it? So standard traffic patterns are to the left. If your traffic pattern goes to the right for whatever reason, it will be noted in your chart supplement guide. That's where you look to find your traffic patterns and what the normal procedures are for that airport. So that's kind of where you look. And you can look at this knowing the different legs. You have your upwind leg, crosswind leg, downwind leg, base, and final. This is telling you here also, these bars are telling you that here, this is how we want you to fly. We want you flying over here on the north side of this runway, and in this case, it's going to be left traffic. And you can look here at this, and you can read what these look like. In this case, where you have the parallel runways, I talked about that before. Here's 9 left, 9 right. You can have multiple operations here, or simultaneous or parallel operations going on these things. As you might expect, this is going to be left traffic. This could be right traffic because they don't want you flying over one another. The no transgression zone. This is that area where you absolutely do not want to overshoot your base to final leg coming in here to land. Because if you loop around over here and you get into the transgression zone, you may be asked to call an 800 number when you land. And normally the people at the other end of that phone are not real sympathetic when it comes to, near midair collisions. So that's something that you're going to definitely want to really understand. This shows you here again kind of a normal traffic pattern, and again guys, we've talked about this before. And you can look, normal traffic pattern altitude, or TPA, is approximately 1,000 feet AGL, and it varies somewhat. In Aspen, we're like 1,200 feet AGL. Key West, Florida is 800 feet AGL. So it varies a little bit. Where do you find that information? Chart supplement guide. So that's kind of what that looks like there. Again, the left-handed pattern, departing the pattern, you can actually have a straight out departure here, on your upwind leg. You can depart at a 45-degree angle here on your upwind leg as soon as you're out of the pattern over here. In some cases, you can depart from your downwind leg if you need to be going the other direction. You call it and you tell them what you're doing. I talked about the normal VFR here, 1200 on your transponder, so you're squawking VFR here. Remember also how they call your traffic. They may call your traffic here at 2 o'clock because you're holding a ground track here that may be north, but you're having to kind of turn the airplane a little to the left to hold that ground track. Air traffic control cannot tell the heading of your airplane. The only thing it can tell is your course. It paints your course along the ground. So they look at your course line. They don't know what your heading is based on the wind. So if they see your course here and they say traffic 2 o'clock, you don't want to look at your 2 o'clock. You would think, what's 2 o'clock to my course line? Because your 2 o'clock may actually be somewhere over here behind you based on your wind correction angle. Okay? So there's that. And that we get into the basic radar services. So for tomorrow, I want you guys to finish reading chapter 13, and oh, there it is. That's the end of chapter 13. So there we are. One last thing that I'll say here. There's a note here talking about ATIS. Remember we talked about the Automatic Terminal Information Service or system that we have that gives you not just weather information but operational information. They do this at towered airports. And they label each one of these with a standard broadcast. We went over this when we talked about METARs, is that at some point they'll call that one Bravo. Please advise on initial contact you have information Bravo. Well, the next hour you could have information Charlie. The next hour it could be information Delta. So they change that every hour. It used to be back in the days that you could call them up and you could say, I have the numbers. They don't like that. That's not what you do anymore, because they don't know, okay, what numbers do you have? You need to tell them which broadcast you just listened to, because it may be old news. So you have to tell them with information Charlie. Even when you're getting ready to taxi on the ground, you talk to ground information 121.9er in Aspen, and you let them know Aspen ground, Diamond Star 141 Hotel Lima, the North Tie Down area, ready to taxi with information whiskey, okay, or whatever it's going to be. They want to know that you know what the current altimeter settings are, the wind settings, as well as any other operational information for that airport. So you can't just say, have the numbers. That doesn't cut it anymore. You got to be more specific, okay? So, brush up on 13, be ready to go, and also read chapter 14 for tomorrow, okay? Guys, there we go. Have an awesome day, and we will see you tomorrow. Bye.